Number 10. Futoshi Matsunaga. He didn't need a weapon. He didn't need brute force. What Futoshi Matsunaga needed was something far more dangerous: total psychological control over the people around him. In the late 1980s and through the 1990s, Matsunaga, a former door-to-door salesman from Kita-Kyushu, began building what investigators would later describe as a private cult of fear inside ordinary apartment walls. He was charming, persuasive, and methodical, a man who understood how to make people dependent on him before they ever realized what was happening. Former girlfriends, family members of those girlfriends, and eventually entire family units fell into his orbit, and once they were in, leaving was nearly impossible. Matsunaga, employed with mental health professionals, would later classify as coercive control, financial manipulation, physical punishment, and an elaborate system of psychological dominance that kept his victims paralyzed with fear and isolation. He convinced those around him that they were guilty of crimes against him, that they owed him, that the outside world was more dangerous than whatever he chose to do to them inside that apartment. Over time, the people in his circle began to turn on each other at his instruction. Family members informed on one another, alliances shifted, trust collapsed entirely. Between 1996 and 1998, 7 people died, including children, under circumstances Matsunaga either directly caused or orchestrated through manipulation of others. The most chilling aspect of the case wasn't the acts themselves, but the mechanism. Many of those who died were killed by the very people who loved them, acting under Matsunaga's psychological direction. When the case finally broke open in 2002, it was not through a dramatic investigation tip alone. It was through the testimony of a survivor, a woman who had spent years in his grip and finally found the courage to speak. What she described to investigators painted a picture so disturbing that Japanese law enforcement had no real framework to categorize it. How do you prosecute a man who convinced others to do his killing for him? The legal proceedings were extraordinarily complex. Matsunaga and Junko Ogata were tried separately from other defendants, with courts wrestling over degrees of culpability. In 2005, both Matsunaga and Ogata were sentenced to death. The case went through years of appeals, with Matsunaga's sentence confirmed and Ogata's sentence eventually reduced to life imprisonment after she claimed she too had been under his psychological influence. Japan watched the trial with quiet horror. It forced a national reckoning about what domestic abuse could look like, not always bruises and broken bones, but invisible chains. The Kita-Kyushu murders, as they became known, led to expanded conversations about coercive control legislation that Japan had been slow to adopt. But there's a question that lingers even today. Matsunaga's psychological methods were so effective they manipulated trained observers, so the unsettling implication remains: how many people, in cities, in quiet apartments, behind perfectly normal doors, are still living inside someone else's invisible prison?
Number 9. Tsutomu Miyazaki. There are cases that change a country, and then there are cases that change what a country believes about itself. In the summer of 1988, something began happening in the suburban prefectures northwest of Tokyo, in Saitama and Tokyo's Itabashi district, that would, over the course of 18 months, shatter Japan's image of itself as a uniquely safe, uniquely ordered society. Young girls between the ages of 4 and 7 began disappearing. Tsutomu Miyazaki was 26 years old, quiet, and largely unremarkable to the people who knew him. He worked in a photo printing shop, he lived with his family, and he collected an enormous library of videotapes, anime, horror films, slasher movies, thousands of them, stacked floor to ceiling in his room. To most people, he barely registered. Between August 1988 and June 1989, Miyazaki abducted and murdered 4 young girls. The investigation was agonizing for police. The cases were geographically spread, the victims had no obvious connection, and the evidence at initial scenes was frustratingly sparse. Families were left in a state of unbearable uncertainty. In at least one case, remains were returned to a family in a package sent by Miyazaki himself, accompanied by written communication that was so disturbing it took investigators considerable time to fully process what they were dealing with. The break in the case came not through surveillance or forensic breakthroughs, but almost random proximity. In July 1989, a man spotted Miyazaki acting suspiciously near a young girl in a park in Tokyo. He confronted him. Miyazaki fled, was caught, and when police searched his room, they found a collection of evidence so extensive and so disturbing that investigators described it as unlike anything they had encountered. The arrest sent a shockwave through Japanese society that is difficult to overstate. Miyazaki didn't look like a monster, he looked like the quiet young man next door, and that was precisely the problem. His trial became a battleground between psychiatrists. Defense experts argued Miyazaki suffered from severe mental illness and dissociative states. Prosecution countered that his crimes demonstrated clear planning and deliberate concealment. The court ultimately sided with the prosecution. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death. But it was the cultural fallout that proved most enduring. Japanese media, searching for an explanation, latched onto his videotape collection, specifically his anime and horror content. The result was a moral panic that swept through the country, targeting otaku culture, manga, and animation with unprecedented suspicion. Collectors and fans found themselves viewed with sudden public hostility. The stigma lasted for years. Miyazaki was executed in June 2008, but the questions his case ignited about isolation, media consumption, and the warning signs society misses never really went away. And perhaps the most haunting question of all, in a country where neighbors rarely speak and silence is considered polite, how many people saw something in Tsutomu Miyazaki's behavior and simply looked away?
Number 8. Seisaku Nakamura. Long before Japan's post-war era produced its infamous modern killers, one name cast a shadow so dark it was deliberately buried, hidden in wartime censorship and collective shame for decades. Seisaku Nakamura didn't operate in the age of forensic science or national media coverage. He operated in the chaos of wartime Japan in 1938 in the rural reaches of Hyogo Prefecture. And that obscurity may be the only reason his name isn't universally known today. Nakamura was 21 years old when he began killing. A local man from Nishi-Asai village, he had a documented history of antisocial behavior and had shown signs of instability that the community had largely absorbed without intervention, as rural communities of that era often did. Then, over the course of a single night in May 1938, something catastrophic unfolded. Nakamura moved through his village in the dark and silence and killed 9 people. Neighbors, acquaintances, people who lived doors away from him and had known him for years. He used an axe. By morning, Nishi-Asai village was transformed into something the survivors could barely describe. The investigation was swift by necessity. The perpetrator was known to the community almost immediately. Nakamura was apprehended without elaborate pursuit, but the swiftness of capture did nothing to diminish what had occurred. 9 lives, 1 night, 1 young man whom everyone had known. What makes this case particularly significant from a historical lens is what happened next, or more precisely, what didn't happen. Japan in 1938 was a nation preparing for full-scale military expansion.
The government was aggressively managing public perception, and a mass killing of this nature, carried by a young Japanese man in a rural village, was precisely the kind of story the wartime state did not want circulating. Coverage was suppressed. The case was processed quietly. Nakamura was executed in 1939. For decades, his case was one of the least documented mass killings in modern Japanese history, not because it was minor, but because it was inconvenient. It wasn't until historians and criminologists began revisiting suppressed wartime records in later decades that the Nakamura case resurfaced with the gravity it deserved. It challenged the narrative, one Japan had long cultivated both internally and externally, of a fundamentally harmonious, low-violence society. Violence, the records revealed, had been present even then. It had simply been managed out of the public memory. The case raises a question that cuts through more than just Japanese history. When governments control what crimes get remembered and which get erased, what does the historical record of violence actually tell us, and how many Nakamuras, in any country, in any era, have been quietly written out of the story we're allowed to know?
Number 7. Kanae Kijima. She was, by almost every external measure, exactly the kind of woman men wanted to find. Attractive, attentive, warm in the way that makes people feel genuinely seen. She knew how to listen. She knew what to say. She built connections quickly, and she built them, prosecutors would later argue, with devastating intention. Kanae Kijima, born in 1974, discovered the early dating sites and social networking platforms that emerged in Japan in the mid-2000s and recognized in them something most people didn't: an almost unlimited supply of lonely, vulnerable, financially comfortable men. She created profiles, she cultivated relationships, and between 2007 and 2009, 3 of those men died. The victims shared similar profiles: older men, widowed or divorced, financially secure, and deeply lonely. Kijima offered them companionship, warmth, and the prospect of a future together. She moved through their lives with practiced ease, gaining access to their finances and their trust simultaneously. When those men died, in circumstances initially ruled as suicide or natural causes, Kijima collected insurance money and moved on to the next relationship. What made the investigation so difficult was that the deaths, examined in isolation, were plausible. Elderly and middle-aged men do die of natural causes. They do take their own lives. Without a pattern to detect, each case fell through the cracks of a system not designed to connect isolated deaths across different municipalities. It was insurance investigators, not initially the police, who first flagged a suspicious pattern. When multiple life insurance claims began routing back to a single beneficiary, and that beneficiary had a demonstrable romantic connection to each deceased, the picture began to clarify. Kijima was placed under surveillance. Evidence accumulated. In 2009, she was arrested. Her trial gripped Japan in a way that blended horror with something close to morbid fascination. The Japanese media dubbed her the Black Widow, and the label stuck with a cultural force that said something uncomfortable about public attitudes toward female attractiveness and danger. Here was a woman who had weaponized the very qualities society told women to embody: warmth, attentiveness, emotional availability, and use them as instruments. In 2017, after years of proceedings, Kijima was sentenced to death. She maintained various positions throughout the trial, sometimes admitting to administering substances, sometimes disputing the sequence of events, but the court found the evidence overwhelming. Her case sparked genuine debate in Japan about digital-era vulnerability, about the specific loneliness of older men who'd lost spouses, and about how easily the systems meant to protect people could be navigated by someone who understood exactly where the blind spots were. Dating app usage in Japan had been climbing steadily. Her case briefly chilled it. But the loneliness that made her victims vulnerable?
That didn't go anywhere. And perhaps that's the question worth sitting with. How many men right now are looking for connection in places where someone else is looking for them, for entirely different reasons?
Number 6. Hiroaki Hidaka. Some cases disturb because of what was done. Others disturb because of who did it and what it reveals about the institutions trusted to protect people. Hiroaki Hidaka was a police officer, not a former officer, not someone who had been dismissed or disgraced before his crimes came to light, an active duty member of the Osaka Prefectural Police. And between 1994 and 1995, he committed a series of violent crimes that forced Japan to confront a deeply uncomfortable question about the people it entrusted with a badge and a uniform. Hidaka carried out multiple attacks, including murder, in the Osaka area, and investigators would later determine he used his insider knowledge, his understanding of patrol patterns, investigation procedures, and forensic evidence collection to confound early detection. He knew what police looked for. He knew how scenes were processed. He used that knowledge deliberately. When suspicion eventually turned inward and investigators began looking within their own ranks, the institutional discomfort was palpable. The Japanese police force carried a cultural reputation for both effectiveness and insularity, a kind of institutional pride that made internal scrutiny particularly resistant. Acknowledging that a killer had been operating within the force using professional knowledge to evade capture was not merely an embarrassment, it was a structural crisis. The investigation that eventually identified Hidaka required careful navigation of exactly those institutional tensions. Evidence had to be processed by colleagues of the suspect. Interviews had to be conducted in an environment where everyone was acutely aware of what a confirmed guilty verdict would mean for public trust in the entire organization. Hidaka was arrested, tried, and convicted. The sentences handed down reflected the severity of the crimes, but the trial itself was, in many ways, secondary to the institutional fallout. Japan's police force underwent a period of forced self-examination. Questions were raised about psychological screening processes for officers, about the support structures available to personnel, and about whether the cultural insularity of policing, the sense that officers dealt with their problems within the family, so to speak, had allowed warning signs to go unaddressed. The case contributed to an ongoing, long-running public debate in Japan about police accountability that has never been fully resolved. Unlike many countries where similar debates are driven by incidents of excessive force or racial discrimination, Japan's version of this conversation tends to center on transparency, on what happens inside an institution that is culturally encouraged to handle its own affairs privately. For the families affected by Hidaka's crimes, the institutional dimensions were largely irrelevant to their grief. But for Japanese society, a question had been opened that is extraordinarily difficult to close. If someone inside the machine knows exactly how the machine works, what does the machine do about that? Number 5. Yoshio Kodaira. There are killers who emerge from chaos, and then there are killers who are shaped by it, forged in the furnace of war, violence, and institutional failure, until something irreversible takes hold inside them. Yoshio Kodaira is one of the most disturbing figures in Japan's post-war criminal history, not only because of what he did, but because of how clearly the record shows that warning signs were present and ignored at nearly every stage of his life. Born in 1905 in Tochigi Prefecture, Kodaira's early life was marked by violence long before he inflicted it on others. His father was brutal. The household was a place of fear. Criminologists who later studied his case identified in his upbringing many of the conditions that research now associates with the development of violent behavior. though in the Japan of the early 20th century, no such framework existed to intervene. His first known killing occurred in 1923, when he killed his in-law during a domestic dispute. He served time, was released, and then, and this is where the institutional failure becomes impossible to overlook, was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army. The military, aware of his history, deployed him regardless. During his time in the service, he committed violent crimes, including the murder of civilians in occupied China. He returned to Japan not as a broken man, but a man in whom violence had not merely been permitted, but in the context of wartime conduct, structurally encouraged. After Japan's defeat in 1945, Kodaira moved through the devastated landscape of post-war Tokyo, a city of ruins, black markets, and desperate people, many of them young women and girls displaced by the war, searching for food, work connections, or family members. It was among these women and girls that Kodaira found his victims. Between 1945 and 1946, he lured at least 7 women and girls, some as young as 10, with offers of food, clothing, or employment connections. The post-war scarcity made such offers virtually irresistible to those with nothing. Once isolated, he attacked and killed them. The victims were found at scattered locations across Tokyo and surrounding areas, and the sheer volume of death in post-war Japan, from starvation, disease, injury, and violence, initially obscured any pattern. It was the investigation into the death of a young girl in Shinjuku in 1946 that unraveled the full picture. A witness had seen Kodaira with the victim near the time of her disappearance. When investigators brought him in for questioning, the interrogation produced first a partial admission and then, gradually, a much larger confession. The scope of what emerged, victim after victim, across more than a year, turned what had seemed like an isolated case into one of the most significant criminal investigations of Japan's post-war period. Kodaira was tried and convicted on multiple counts of murder. He was sentenced to death and executed in 1949. But what the case left behind was more than a verdict. It became an early and critical case study in how war, specifically the moral desensitization, institutional brutality, and social devastation that war produces, can function as an incubator for domestic violence on a catastrophic scale. Kodaira had not invented his violence from nothing. He had been handed it, shaped by it, and then returned to civilian society as if transformation were simply a matter of removing a uniform. Japan in 1946 was trying to rebuild its physical infrastructure while simultaneously processing a collective trauma so immense it had no name. Kodaira's victims were, in a terrible sense, casualties of that same war, targeted precisely because the war had left them with nothing in a city that had nothing left to protect them with. His case eventually influenced early Japanese discussions about the rehabilitation, or lack thereof, of returning soldiers and about the cascading human cost of militarism that continued to accumulate long after the last bomb had fallen. And the question it leaves behind is one that every society emerging from prolonged conflict eventually has to face. When the war ends, what do you do with the men it made?
Number 4. Issei Sagawa. This is the case that didn't end. Most criminal cases, however disturbing, have a conclusion, a sentence, a closure, a point at which the law renders its verdict and society moves forward. The case of Issei Sagawa has no such closure. And that absence, that open wound in the legal record, is perhaps the most disturbing element of all. Sagawa was a Japanese graduate student studying in Paris in 1981.
He was 29 years old, the son of a wealthy Japanese businessman, and enrolled at the Sorbonne. On June 11th of that year, he invited a fellow student, a Dutch woman named Renee Hartfelt, to his apartment under the pretense of a language exchange meeting. He shot her, and then over the following days committed acts that international press coverage at the time struggled to describe in terms acceptable for publication. He was arrested by French police. The evidence was overwhelming. What followed, however, was a legal process that produced one of the most staggering outcomes in modern criminal justice history. French psychiatrists evaluated Sagawa and declared him legally insane, not responsible for his actions. He was committed to a French psychiatric institution. Then, in 1984, in a decision that French authorities would later say they deeply regretted, he was extradited back to Japan at his wealthy father's request and transferred to a Japanese psychiatric facility. Upon evaluation by Japanese psychiatrists, he was found to be sane, but here the legal machinery jammed entirely. French authorities had declined to share the evidence file for use in a Japanese prosecution, and without that evidence, Japan could not try him for the crime. He was released in 1986. Free. What happened next is where the case metastasizes into something beyond criminal justice and into something almost surreal. Sagawa became, in the years that followed, a minor celebrity in Japan. He wrote books, including a memoir about the murder that became a bestseller. He published widely. He appeared on television programs and gave media interviews. He wrote food criticism columns. He was, for a period, an identifiable figure in Tokyo's media landscape, existing in public space with a casualness that drew international disbelief. For the family of his victim, this was an ongoing torment without legal recourse. For legal scholars globally, the case became a textbook example of how gaps between national jurisdictions can produce outcomes that no individual legal system intended, but none could individually correct. Sagawa reportedly suffered serious health issues in later years and has lived in reduced circumstances since the collapse of his public profile. But he was never tried, never convicted, never sentenced. The question that has followed this case for over 4 decades is not complicated. It is devastatingly simple. How does a justice system look at what happened, look at the man who did it, and arrive at the answer, free to go? Nobody, in any country, has ever been able to fully answer that.
Number 3. Shoko Asahara. There is evil that is individual. One person, one darkness, and then there is evil that learns how to recruit. Shoko Asahara, born Chizuo Matsumoto in 1955, was nearly blind from birth, partially sighted in one eye. He grew up in modest circumstances, attended a school for the visually impaired, and drifted through various pursuits in early adulthood before founding a yoga class in Tokyo in the mid-1980s. That class became a movement. That movement became a religion. That religion became, in the assessment of Japanese courts, a murder organization operating in plain sight. Om Shinrikyo, Asahara's group, whose name roughly translates to Supreme Truth, grew with alarming speed through the late 1980s. It attracted educated young Japanese, engineers, scientists, doctors, university graduates who were drawn to Asahara's blend of Buddhism, Hinduism, apocalyptic Christian prophecy, and his own increasingly elaborate claims of divine authority. At its peak, the organization had thousands of members in Japan, in significant outposts in Russia. The group's internal evolution from fringe spiritual movement to terrorist organization happened in stages, and each stage was carefully concealed from members who were not yet deemed ready for the truth. Members were subjected to intense psychological conditioning, financial extraction, and isolation from family in mainstream society. Those who tried to leave found it remarkably difficult. Those who raised questions found themselves facing consequences. By the early 1990s, Asahara had begun ordering murders of members who had defected, of attorneys representing victims' families, of perceived enemies. The group was manufacturing chemical weapons inside compounds that had been established with the financial resources of its membership. On March 20, 1995, members of Aum Shinrikyo released sarin gas on 5 lines of the Tokyo subway system during the morning rush hour. 13 people died. Approximately 50 others suffered severe injuries. Thousands more experienced symptoms from secondary exposure. The Tokyo subway, one of the busiest transit systems on Earth, became a crime scene during peak commuting hours. The attack shook Japan to a level that had no modern precedent. This was not a foreign threat, not a geopolitical adversary. These were Japanese citizens, many of them educated and talented, who had been systematically transformed into weapons by a man presenting himself as a messiah. Asahara was arrested in May 1995, found hiding inside a compound in Kamikushi-ishiki. His trial lasted years. He was convicted of murder and multiple other offenses and sentenced to death. He was executed in July 2018, along with several senior members of the organization. The legacy of Aum Shinrikyo reshaped Japan's legal framework around religious organizations and counterterrorism, and the subway attack remains the lens through which an entire generation of Japanese people understand the concept of domestic terrorism. But here is what keeps researchers returning to this case. The members who carried out the attack were not uneducated, not desperate, not obviously lost. They were people who had been systematically convinced that what they were doing was righteous, which means the question isn't just who Asahara was. The question is, what was it about the society around him that left so many educated people so empty, so searching, and so available to be filled?
Number 2. Sada Abe. Some cases don't just live in the criminal record. They live in the cultural memory, in literature, in film, in the language itself. The case of Sada Abe is one of those. It is a story that Japan has never been able to fully put down, and it is worth understanding why. May 1936, Tokyo. A former geisha and cafe waitress named Sada Abe had been engaged in an extended, intense affair with the proprietor of a restaurant where she had worked as a server. The relationship was passionate and consuming, documented in detail through later testimony that the Japanese media of the era treated with a mixture of horror and hypnotic fascination. On May 18, 1936, Abe's lover, Kichizo Ishida, was found dead in the room of an inn in Nakano, Tokyo. He had been strangled. In the days that followed, the manner of his death and what Abe had done after it became a scandal that spread through Tokyo's newspapers with a velocity that the authorities found almost unmanageable. Abe fled. For 4 days, she was at large in the city, and the search for her became a media sensation in real time. When she was found and arrested on May 20th, her appearance and calm demeanor and police photographs taken immediately after her arrest became some of the most reproduced images of their era. She was, by any objective account, composed, almost serene. Her testimony was extraordinary in its candor. She spoke openly and at length about the relationship, its nature, in the events of that night. She expressed no sense of having done something she wished to take back. The psychological complexity of what she described and the questions it raised about desire, obsession, consent, and violence were questions that Japanese society of 1936 had no real intellectual vocabulary to process. She was tried and convicted of murder and other charges, sentenced to 6 years imprisonment.
But with Japan's entry into the Pacific War, political amnesty was issued in 1940, and she was released. She spent the following decades in quiet, largely obscured existence, giving occasional interviews, but refusing to become a fixed public figure. What happened next is where the case becomes something entirely unusual in criminal history. Sada Abe's story was adapted, reimagined, and reinterpreted by successive generations of Japanese and then international artists. Novelist Junsuke Yoshiyuki wrote about it. Director Nagisa Oshima adapted it into In the Realm of the Senses in 1976, a film so explicit it was banned in Japan for years and remains controversial internationally. The case became a touchstone for discussions of erotic obsession, gender, power, and the ambiguous territory between passion and destruction. Sada Abe died, most historians believe, sometime in the late 1960s or early 1970s, though this is disputed. Her fate in later life is genuinely unknown. And in that unknowing, in the fact that she simply disappeared from the record, while her story continued to grow larger and larger in cultural imagination, there is something appropriate. She became a symbol precisely because no one could contain what she represented within any single frame. What does it mean when a crime becomes art? What does it mean when a killer becomes an icon? And what does it say about us that we keep returning to this story nearly 90 years later and still don't entirely know how to hold it?
Number 1. Miyuki Ishikawa. At the top of every list of Japan's most notorious killers, one might expect the most dramatic story, the most explosive crime, the most theatrical capture. What sits at number 1 instead is something quieter, more systematic, and in many ways more disturbing than anything else on this list. Because Miyuki Ishikawa didn't kill in secret. She killed in a hospital, with documentation, with a staff around her, and for years with the tacit awareness, at minimum, of the institution that employed her. Ishikawa was a licensed midwife and the director of Kotobuki Maternity Hospital in Tokyo in the late 1940s. In the aftermath of World War II, Japan was devastated, physically scarred, struggling to feed and house the population that had survived. The birth rate in the post-war years was high, and an enormous number of families found themselves unable to care for newborn children. Abortion was not yet legally accessible in Japan. It would not become so until 1948, and even then, under limited circumstances. Ishikawa, placed in a position of medical authority and trusted by desperate families, saw in this humanitarian crisis a business opportunity. Parents who could not care for their newborns would bring them to her hospital. Ishikawa would accept payment, sometimes from the parents, sometimes from others, and the infants would simply not survive. They were not given the care they required. They were allowed to deteriorate. In some cases, evidence suggested more active intervention. The scale of what she orchestrated was, and remains, almost impossible to absorb. Estimates based on evidence examined at trial suggested she was responsible for the deaths of somewhere between 103 and 169 infants, though some historical researchers have proposed the true number may be higher. In terms of confirmed victim count, she is believed to be Japan's most prolific killer. The case broke open in 1948 when an undertaker, alarmed by the frequency with which he was being called to the hospital, reported his suspicions to police. Investigators found not just evidence of infant deaths, but financial records, payment arrangements, ledgers, documentation suggesting a systematic operation rather than isolated negligence. Ishikawa was arrested. Her husband and a physician who had assisted in the scheme were also arrested. The trial resulted in a conviction for murder. The original sentence was 8 years, a figure that struck many, then and now, as shockingly disproportionate to the scale of the crimes. On appeal, the sentence was reduced.
She served only a fraction of even that. She was released in 1952. She lived until 1985. Documented sources differ on her later years, but she lived. She lived for decades after. Japan processed the case through a lens heavily colored by the post-war context. The humanitarian crisis was real. The legal framework for infant protection was genuinely inadequate. Abortion legalization occurred precisely because of pressures the Ishikawa case exemplified. Some revisionist historical voices have argued that Ishikawa operated inside a societal failure larger than any single person, and that placing all moral weight on her individual actions obscures the broader collapse that made her possible. But there are 103 infants, at minimum, possibly far more, and the woman responsible received less time in prison than many shoplifters receive for property crimes in other jurisdictions. The Ishikawa case is not remembered with the popular notoriety of some others. There were no dramatic manhunts, no shocking trials broadcast nationally, no cultural reinvention in later decades. It was absorbed quietly, processed institutionally, and allowed to recede. And perhaps that is the most disturbing thing of all. Not that Japan produced a killer of this magnitude, but that when confronted with her, the systems in place, legal, institutional, cultural, looked at what she had done and found ways to minimize it, to contextualize it, to move on from it. How many systems in how many countries are doing exactly the same thing right now, looking at something that should be impossible to excuse and finding the language to excuse it anyway? The case of Miyuki Ishikawa doesn't haunt Japan because it was sensational. It haunts Japan because it was quiet. And quiet, it turns out, is the most dangerous thing of all.